Hi everyone, I'm Yannick Roseau from the St. Lawrence River Institute of Environmental Sciences. I'm really happy to welcome you all to the Science and Nature on the secret life of eels. So a few things before we get started. So Science and Nature is a free speaker series held by the River Institute on the last Thursday of every month on a variety of different topics related to science and nature, to try and get the public a little bit more involved in the work that we're conducting both at the River Institute but also outside of our organization along the St. Lawrence River and beyond. So for those who are joining us online, if you would like to drop in the comment section and let us know where you're coming from, where you're joining us from today, that would be wonderful. And throughout the presentation, if you have any questions for Marianne or Abraham, you can also put them in the chat box and we'll get back to them afterwards during the question and answer period, which will be about 15 minutes long at the end. Okay, and I'd also like to acknowledge that we're coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, and that it is a privilege to live, care for, and play on this land. We offer our gratitude to the Mohawks of Akwesasne for their teachings and care for the earth and our relations, and we strive to continue to improve the health of this great river that we are so lucky to call home. The River Institute also has some social media channels if you'd like to follow our work, including a LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook, and then our River Institute website, which also has all of the recordings from our past Science and Natures. And our next talk will be by Matt Windle, who's also here with us today. Matt will be presenting on reviving the river's edge, restoring resilient shoreline habitats. And it'll be in the new year, so this is our last Science and Nature in 2025, and we'll be resuming in January. So about our speakers, so Abraham Francis is a PhD candidate at Clarkson University studying environmental science and engineering, and holds a Bachelor's of Science in Microbiology and a Master's of Science and Natural Resources from Cornell University. Previously, Abraham was the Environmental Services Manager for the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, a position which allowed him to develop and implement projects inspired and directed by community needs and influenced by his research interests. Abraham is the founder of the Aronia Collective, which seeks to align Indigenous communities with experts to meet their unique needs and non-Indigenous organizations to engage Indigenous peoples meaningfully. Dr. Ann Perron is also going to be presenting today, and she is a Liber Aero postdoctoral fellow at the River Institute, cross-pointed with Nipissing University. She is the scientific lead for a community-driven ecosystem health assessment of the St. Lawrence River called the Great River Rapport Project. Mary Ann has a Bachelor's of Science in Conservation and Restoration Ecology from Laurentian University and a PhD in Biology from the University of Ottawa. Her research interests include wetland and river ecology, conservation ecology, entomology, and botany. So we're really thrilled to have two incredible speakers joining us today. Please help me in welcoming them. Okay. Give you this.
Awesome.
Switch the slides.
So, sego sewa gwego, delhunu hiate yungat, swagania trono, dana ganya kahaga, nana Akwesasne ganagale. So, hi, my name is Abraham Francis. I'm Deer Clan and Mohawk from the community of Akwesasne, born and raised. I actually am currently a policy analyst for the Chiefs of Ontario in their environment sector and really enjoying that work. And always just love being able to work with the River Institute on so many wonderful projects, especially this one here, which is so near and dear to my heart, that we've spent years talking about and creating action. And so a bit of this story, The Tale of the Eel, A New Dawn, is really about what does the future of the eel look like and how can we be a part of that.
Hi everyone, my name is Ann Perron and I'm a research scientist and postdoctoral fellow at the River Institute. And I've been working on the eel report for the River Report, and I'm excited to share what we've been working on for the past couple of years. So I'll pass it back to Abe.
Wonderful. So I wanted to start with this poem by Fred Schuler, him and his infamous wife, and the work that they do all along the St. Lawrence. I'm just obsessed with them. And actually this was one of the first poems within the art collection, the art competition, gathering, whatever we did, that I read, and I just remember feeling so much grief at the end. So I am a balance of life and death and migration. N less a billion may not be enough. Are you still watching for me? Am I still here? Go down to the sunny spring shore to check, am I still here? Go down to the silver autumn sound and check, am I still here? Where are the salt marshes and the knothole ponds? Where has Lake Ontario gone? Where is Campbell Creek? Am I still here? Eels can live anywhere, even in a canal. Eels can live anywhere, even in sewage. Eels can live anywhere, even in a clear cut. Eels can live anywhere, even in a subdivision. Eels can live anywhere, even in a landfill. I am the eternal bounty of the sea washing up onto your shore. Pickle me in leachate, smoke me with PCBs. Do not weep for me. There will be no mitigation when I am gone. I will be more invisible than leptocephali when I am gone. Black will be the Sargasso depths when I am gone. Black as today. Clear will be the Atlantic waters, clear as today. Watch for my death, watch for my going, watch for me. Come down to the shore to be sure the spring has come, as silent as my coming will be the spring when I am gone. N less a billion may not be enough. And I just really love this piece that is articulating a potential future for us that we may not have the eel anymore. And I'm hoping all this effort and this work that we do can make that future not possible and that we're able to change this. And I believe that we are being quite successful in this effort. And a big part of this work and this acknowledgement is it began with community. It began with a community report of eels accruing in Akwesasne. And these bodies here that reflected and shown themselves through the surface of the water. You can see this is Gowanoge right here. And this is where they started to accrue. And so it was a family around here that notified us of those bodies accruing. And it launched so much activity. It was some work that we had been doing sort of off the corners of our desks for years, and then all of a sudden it became this emergency moment to respond. And I'm really grateful to the wonderful collaborations between the River Institute and MCA, and just being able to be a part of this process. And then just to sit with this reality of the dead and dying eels found at the base of the Moses Saunders Power Dam. Now it's 3 years. And these photos, what it really bothers me mostly about these kinds of photos is, there's some living eels in there. And, there would be eels that would be found that would look perfectly fine, and they would be slowly dying from injuries from turbines. And as I sort of continued on this journey of understanding, I had to sort of sit with, what does the eel mean to me? Where did the eel come into my life? And more recently, I had been asked a question of when was the last time I had seen a live eel? And within my sort of memory, I can't imagine if I imagined it or not, but I can remember fishing and maybe somebody caught one and they cut their line and they're like, eels are bad and scare away the fish. And that's one of the first memories I have of them, or the smell of them when our dogs would roll in them. And it really bothered me that I had never seen a live eel. I'd never been exposed in that way. And to think such a beautiful creature lives right here next to us. And it really started this beautiful journey for me in trying to understand, where does the eel come into our story? And this story is really about grief. It's about how our community first experienced death. And in that time, we didn't know how to reconcile that, and people were grieving, and our whole communities were grieving the loss of different people in our communities, and we weren't able to fulfill our roles and responsibility to the world around us. And so everything stopped. But then a teacher came to us, and what they brought to us was a story about how we were supposed to, where he asked the women that were the head of houses, these what would become clan mothers, and he put a rope across the river, and a portion of them got across before the rope broke. And they were told that each morning they would have to go and grab some water from the river. And the first thing they would see, they would have to take note of. And this is how the clans entered into our lives. And the eel is one of those clans for us. It's a clan that's held by the Onondagas, I believe. And that dimension of it really, really resonates with me, to think about how we're losing that relative and that connection and this guidance, because when somebody passes, we now have this teaching that it's the responsibility of the other side of the house to care for one side of the house when someone passes, and allow them those 10 days of grief, to allow them to understand the loss that has happened and pick up those roles and responsibilities that were left behind for them. And in this way, that intergenerational knowledge transfer and communication between the past and the future merge through this clan system. And this is how we are directly tied as a people to the land. We might say, like I said, Waganya Trono. So the clay that I'm shaped out of is actually deer, right? And these are the different ways that we recognize and we connect to these landscapes as a people that emerge from this place and are reflected in these landscapes. And what I really love too is like the exploration adventures that, you know, me and Stephanie have been on, from Mi'kmaq territory, to see the eel represented in their artwork, to see this this niche representation of the eel and their connectivity, because, you know, for the Algonquins on the Ottawa River, they don't have that relationship anymore. They no longer have those stories and those connections within the living memory of their community. And I wonder what that means to us. Where would those stories like live? What would we do for them? And it always invokes that like memory for me of the passenger pigeon, which was what was actually as I've heard, this really important medicine to our people. And now we only have a dance for it. And would that be sort of the same thing we do for the eel? Is this a failing of our roles and responsibilities that we've been inheriting for generations? And I always worry about what does that mean to our future. And as I sort of continue to dream and think about the implications of this, it's a loss of resilience to the world that we're confronted with. It's a loss of knowledge and values that can make us more resilient to the impacts of climate change. It can make us more resilient to the impacts of late-stage capitalism. Like, I think that there's so many possibilities by engaging and reflecting that relationship and protecting and owning that responsibility. And before I move forward, I just have to acknowledge this gorgeous work by Victoria Ransom. Always such a fan of hers. So much so I got her tattooed on my hand. And just the way that she reflects our traditional teachings with the celestial sky domes, with the celestial tree, with the pottery designs, and just this gorgeous expression of this relationship between the eel and us. And so this all is complemented by this work that we have been doing through the River Rapport, the holistic ecosystem assessment that is framed within the Ohandagaliwa Dekwa, the words that come before all else. And I'm sure you may have come across me before doing my opening address and my closing address at different events. And really this acknowledgement of the world around us. And I think about the fish and the responsibilities that they have, and that they were given the direction to clean the waters. And in my journeys through various jobs, you know, I reinterpreted that as sort of like fish being these indicators of healthy waters, of different kinds of waters, and that their presence is an indication of health, at least in my mind, right? And that this was directly responsive to this, to be able to put efforts into learning more about the eel, amongst other things, right? Like, we're writing about invasive species, we're writing about nutrients, we are writing in so many different ways, questions that are asked from community to ask why, what happened. And what's beautiful about, you know, the eel is it confronts jurisdiction, it confronts industry, politics, it confronts this history we have as a people, and the way that Catholicism interacted with us and implicated our relationship. And I think is a part of that more deeper conversation about the eel. Why did we miss her? What happened to her? And how can we reclaim that and and reject these ideas of what is a priority within the Western colonial system and shift to this more relational accountability to future generations and this inherited responsibility from ancestors. And I just finished a really cool grant. That's why I kind of have these words that are flopping around my brain about intergenerational knowledge transfer. So excuse me on that one. And for Marianne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abe. So I am the scientific lead of that ecosystem health report called the Great River Report, and we work on informing community to provide, to mobilize knowledge that leads to action. So American eel is one of the indicators that we work on. We work on multiple subjects, as Abraham mentioned, and today I'm going to go through some of the findings from the American eel research that we've done. So American eel are really incredible fish. They are top predators in the system, so they have an important role to balance the food web. They are a pan-myctic species, and that means that they have one population throughout their entire range. So, for example, I have a black bear, population back home in Quebec, and there's a black bear population here in Cornwall, and these populations are distinct because their genetics are distinct. When you look at eels, any eel, American eel that you see across the world belongs to one single population, and that's called panmixia. So all eel converge in the Sargasso Sea, right here. So all eel will converge in the Sargasso Sea, and this is near the Bermuda Triangle. They all come together in the Sargasso Sea and lay their eggs. And these eels are semiparous, so they're like salmon. They have one reproductive event, and then they die after that reproductive event. So they have this long life cycle in the river. The average age of the eels in the St. Lawrence River is 22 years. So their life cycle can last 25 years or more in some parts of their range. And they're also catadromous species. So that's the opposite of a salmon. So a salmon will breed in fresh water and mature in salt water. Eels breed in salt water and mature. Some of them mature in fresh water. So it's facultative catadromy. So not all eels need fresh water to mature, but there's certain eels that seek out that freshwater habitat, and these eels are often the females. So in the St. Lawrence River, you can see here, so this orange, the orange here is their plausible historic range. You can see that it spans from Venezuela all the way up to Greenland and Iceland. In the St. Lawrence River, this habitat is among the most important habitat for eels across that entire orange range that you saw in the previous slide. The reason for this is that historically, eels in the St. Lawrence River were 99% female, and they're among the biggest, most fecund females across that entire range. So the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario are extremely productive habitat. It's really great habitat for eels. It's been estimated that they contribute between 1/3 to 2/3 of the eggs of the entire species. So the eels, that is historically, the eels in the St. Lawrence River are very important for the entire population throughout their entire range. So this habitat has sadly had a crash of eel abundance. So this here is a graph. It's a recruitment index. So if you go back and look at their life cycle, we have the eggs that are laid in the Sargasso Sea, the larvae, which are called leptocephali. They metamorphose into glass eels, so the larvae will drift through these currents. The glass eels will reach these coastal waters, and the ones who want to live in fresh waters will start swimming up fresh waters and become yellow eels, which are like teenager eels. The silver eels here, those are adult eels that are ready to sexually mature and make their way back to the Sargasso Sea to breed. From the furthest part of the Lake Ontario range to the Sargasso Sea, it's over 5,500 kilometers. So they have this incredible migration. So in the St. Lawrence River, the eel abundance is not doing very good. So this is data from, it's recruitment data, so it's sort of that teenager eel this is data from the Moses Sounders Dam. We have year here on the x-axis, and you see here in the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of eels in the river. There was over 1 million eels that were going up the eel ladder at the Moses Sanders Dam. Sadly, in 1986, we had this precipitous crash of eel abundance in the river. And we're sitting now, and we have been sitting for a long time, below 5% of what that abundance was in the 1980s and the 1970s. And American eel across the range have experienced declines, but none of them have experienced a decline as severe as the St. Lawrence River. And this is concerning because, as I mentioned, the St. Lawrence River is among the most important of all habitats for American eel. So today we're going to go through the 5 major threats that have been hypothesized as to why American eel populations are declining. And we're going to give you some local context on how these threats are affecting eel, in our backyard here. So the first threat is habitat loss and barriers to migration. And through the research that I've done, I found that this is the biggest threats to American eel in the St. Lawrence River. So if you just think before the dams went in the St. Lawrence River, so we have 2 major dams. We have 2 major dams, the Moses Sanders Dam, which is owned and operated by Ontario Power Generation on the Canadian side and New York Power Authority on the American side. And then we have the other major dam is Beauharnois, and that is owned and operated by Hydro-Quebec. So basically Lake St. Francis has a dam upstream and a dam downstream. And if you could picture before those dams went in, eels were able to freely swim through the river. They, went all the way to Lake Ontario. They were able to get to all this really great productive habitat. And in the river in 1958, that all changed. So the Moses Sanders Dam was put in, and eel, through their migration, were not able to get to the habitat that they needed to survive. So this dam acted as a barrier for them. And this impacts the amount of eel that the river can support because it impacts the carrying capacity of the river. So if you have, the St. Lawrence River and you put a dam in the middle of the river, there's only half the habitat now that's available for eel to mature. So there's only half the amount of food, half the space, half of, certain chemical variables that affect fish. You can't have too dense of a population. So when you're fragmenting habitats, you're removing the amount of habitat and you're removing the number of eels that a habitat can support. So there was a study done for CSAS and in the St. Lawrence watershed. So the authors here, all of this gray sort of shaded area is what they studied. And they looked at the number of dams throughout the St. Lawrence watershed, and that includes the major tributary of the St. Lawrence River, which is the Ottawa River. And they found that there was over 8,400 dams just in this gray shaded area. So you could picture we have these 2 major dams in the St. Lawrence River, but if you look across all of the tributaries of the St. Lawrence River, there's over 8,400 of these dams. So that's 8,400 barriers for American eel that are a migratory species, and they do need to move through these systems. So they estimated that through this damming of the watershed, American eel lost over 12,000 kilometer squares of freely accessible habitat, and they were able to calculate an estimation of the amount of eels that habitat can support, which is over 800,000 eels per year upstream of all of those dams. So because we put all those dams in throughout the watershed, we reduced the carrying capacity, so the number of eels that a system can support, by over 800,000. If you look specifically to the upper St. Lawrence River, so upstream of Beauharnois Dam, we lost 5,800 kilometers square of habitat upstream of Beauharnois, sorry. And they estimated that to nearly 400,000 eels per year. So the habitat upstream of Beauharnois can support approximately 400,000 eels per year. And when they put those dams in 1958, and the Beauharnois Dam went in 1961, basically they removed all of that habitat that was supporting this large number of eels. And this is not particular to the St. Lawrence River. This is the plausible range slide here again. So their range is in orange. And every little red point here is a dam. So their entire range has been fragmented through the construction of dams. And if you look at when those dams were constructed, so this is just the number of dams here and the year of construction, most of the dams were constructed at the same time as the Moses Sounders Dam and the Beauharnois Dam. So in the 50s and the 60s, basically eel were able to freely swim throughout their entire range. And in the matter of 2 decades, most of that range in freshwater habitats was lost to the eel. Luckily for us, in the St. Lawrence River, we do have eel ladders. So the Moses Sounders Dam went in 1958, and an eel ladder went in 1974. So in 1974, that upstream habitat was opened back up at the Moses Sounders Dam. Beauharnois has eel ladders that went in the early 2000s. So from the early 2000s on, the upstream habitat of the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario is now accessible to American eel. So this is a picture of the Moses Sounders eel ladder on the Canadian side. And this water here, this flow attracts the eels, and then the eels will find the ladder and they make their way up this ladder. And it's actually quite extensive. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but they have a long way to go, and eels are incredible. Someone once said to me, never underestimate what an eel can do. And they are truly incredible fish. If there's a way, they're going to find it. So they get up these tiny little, they find these tiny little ladders in the kilometer-wide stretch of the river, and they get up that ladder. And just thinking back to the old recruitment slide, at a time in the 70s and the 80s, 1 million eels were finding this ladder and going up the ladder every year, which is like an incredible amount of eels. So great, our eels, they were swimming freely. Then they had this barrier in 1958. In 1974, an eel ladder was put in, and these eels could now get up the eel ladder and make it upstream. And that habitat, although not as easy as not having a dam at all, there became a way for them to get past the barrier and to open up that habitat and to increase that carrying capacity of the river once again. The only issue with this is, as I mentioned, with their life cycle, they mature in freshwater. So they spend, over 20 years, about 22 years, they start getting the cue that they need to go back to the sea. They need to go and lay their eggs. So all the eels upstream of these dams now need to get back to the Sargasso Sea, and they need to find their way back to the Sargasso Sea. And there's no ladder to get them back over the dam downstream. The only way for them to get downstream of these dams is for them to go through the turbines. So these, the Moses Sounders Dam and the Beauharnois Dam are hydroelectric facilities, and they have these huge turbines. And as you could probably imagine, these eels, when they're silver eels, so these adult eels ready to sexually mature, they're sometimes over 1 meter long. So 1 meter long, sort of tube-shaped fish needs to get through these turbines that are spinning at incredible speeds. And you could just imagine what happens to them. And that's what those pictures are from, those piles of severed eels. They're these silver eels that, they're over 20 years old. They're ready to go lay their eggs and have their babies, and they're trying to make it back to the sea, and they're getting severed through these turbines. So it's a big problem in the St. Lawrence River. So as I mentioned, habitat loss and barriers to migration have been identified as the biggest threat to eels. And if you look at those numbers, so this is a study, it's outdated, but the percentages still hold true. So they did this work in 1996 and 1997. And through, they did the Moses Sounders Dam and Beauharnois Dam, both estimated mortality rates. And at the Moses Sounders Dam, they have estimated that 26% of all eels that go through the turbines die. And at the Beauharnois Dam, that number is about 18% of all eels. So cumulatively, it's over 44% of all eels that try to make it back to the sea are they're killed in these turbines. And if you compare that to fishing, so this is just silver eels, so they're the large eels that are trying to get back to their Sargasso Sea. There's only 4% of those eels that are fished that come from the upper St. Lawrence River. 44% of those die in turbines. So together, nearly half of all eels from the upper St. Lawrence River in Lake Ontario are killed from human impacts. So it's been estimated that 52% of eels from Lake Ontario and from the upper St. Lawrence River can make it to the estuary and try to get back to the sea to spawn. So as you could imagine, that has a huge impact on the abundance of a species in a river if you're losing almost half of that species every year. And when they did this study, so this is, as I mentioned, from 1996 and 1997, they were able to calculate the number of eel that died that year. And we did have more eel back in the late 90s than we do today. But in 1996, this number was over 200,000 eels died in turbines in 1996. So it's a significant amount of eel.
And I think this picture really captures that reality for us. And specifically in this story that we're learning and we're cultivating and we're sharing with people. And in particular, Stephanie spoke to this, and I remember this reflection about how they're designed for camouflage on the bottom of the river, and that there is something really, there's a call for help when they expose their white stomachs. And we think about this in relationship to the declining populations. And as an Akwesaslono, it's almost like, I almost missed this story. Like, I almost missed this, what was happening right before my eyes. And, and even thinking about that too, like, I remember stories from Henry about the eel that, like, when they would migrate up, it would look like the water was shining. And there were these really significant moments of movement that were, the community understood and felt. And now we don't. And I can't help but think about what is the implication, or what does it mean for us to fulfill our roles and responsibilities within this new landscape. Historically it was like medicines and fish for food, art for relationships, and now to sort of look at this future where they need us, and what might that look like in this new political landscape. And one of the most powerful tools in communicating this is artwork, and calling in that art that can capture the feeling, the emotion, that can capture layers of relationships beyond just our graphs and our research, right? Where we're trying to get people to care and to reclaim that relationship with the eel. And this is a beautiful piece by Yagutni Goliosta, Sisters in Survival, and the way that she took and understood what we were talking about what I like to call our big aunties, and in the river, and the implication of them journeying down the river, and the way that they are being harmed in that process. And she integrated so many different beautiful pieces of work into this. And, I remember her talking about this and how difficult it is to get a curb when you're doing quilting. And this is a humongous piece, and it was displayed at the River Symposium this last year, and I've keep meeting it, and I keep getting the opportunity to sit with these different hues of blue and the different sort of reflections on what is she trying to say in regards to the four directions here. Why was there this choice of coloring? And I get to keep kind of sitting and meditating with that reality. Why did she choose to only put 3 eel in the middle in what I consider the turbine? Is that our traditional teachings, our skana, gas and stasla, gatni guhlio? Is that us as a people trying to hold and advocate and say something, and through our relationship, we were able to explore that more, but also that I'm able to find new insights through the reflection on artwork like this.
So that was our first thread, and we'll go through the next thread. So fisheries was another thread that I looked into, and so in the Upper St. Lawrence River, we had the yellow eel fisheries and the silver. There's a small number of silver eels, as you saw, that are captured in the commercial fishery. This is different than the lucrative glass eel fishery that we see in the Maritimes. So in Ontario, the American eel is an endangered species, and the commercial fishery for American eel closed in 2004. This is just an excerpt from a news article. So it was actually, the commercial fishermen in Ontario and in Quebec as well, they are, the ones that started noticing declines in eels in the 80s. And they went to, in this sense, this fisherman here went to John Castleman, who is a famous eel biologist for Lake Ontario and the river. He went to see John Castleman in 1989, and I'll just read this. But one day in 1989, that began to change. Warbeck went to his friend John Castleman, a longtime biology professor at Queen's University, who had studied eels most of his career. There's a problem, Warbeck told him, and it could soon affect the 100 eel fishermen in the region, as well as the species. So their eel, particularly these yellow and silver eels, they became very popular overseas in the 60s, and there was, a good eel commercial fishery. But as I mentioned, the eel fishery is now closed in Ontario. So these fishermen lost their jobs and they lost their livelihoods. In Quebec in 2009, there was this huge buyback program. So there used to be 67 eel fishing licenses, and most of the eel fishing in Quebec is at the estuary. And the buyback program, after that was done in 2009, there was only 15 active eel fishing licenses. So fisheries, it could have definitely contributed to some of the declines we've seen. But for example, the eel fishery in Ontario has been closed for 20 years now, and we still haven't seen any recovery of the eel population.
So another love of mine is fish consumption, and I think about fish consumption from many multiple ways, but most importantly, I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of fish, but I ultimately sort of inquire, why? And a big piece of that comes back to the fact is I didn't grow up eating fish, and I kept asking why. Why didn't I grow up with fish in this way? And I think about what happened in Akwesasne and how we were implicated from so many different circumstances, from poverty to houses to all of the different ways that we were impacted by the system here, that ultimately implicated our relationship, and most importantly, the environmental violence that we experienced, the pollution that we experienced as a people that implicated our relationship with the fish. And it's hard to reconcile this because we have a responsibility to consume fish. And so, I'm grateful to have been a part of such beautiful work to reconceptualize what that might look like. To think about fish consumption and looking at the fish population. What is the nutrition we get from eating fish? What is the contaminant load? But also, what is the responsibility that exists there? What knowledge is embedded in that relation? What language is there? What medicines are there? And that we have a responsibility as a people to gather and hand on to future generations. And as a part of this sort of contamination work, what I really love is that the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, based off of engagement with the community, looked at a family approach. And I think it really makes sense to us, why would I consume fish if my whole family can't consume fish? And so they came up with all of these wonderful assessments. And I think, we're moving in a really beautiful direction to be able to continue to update this with new data, new information, and so people can feel more comfortable in their exposure as a part of this responsibility. But there is still that continual fear, and I hope that there's a community that knows and can have a protocol in place to help them engage in a way that is harm reductive, but is ultimately allowing us to stay continually connected to the eel, so we can see when things happen, or we can know if something's working. We see it, we experience that. And then from Marianne's perspective, and
Yeah, so just going back to the fisheries and how this contamination relates to like the settler fisheries. In the 70s, the eel fishery was closed because mercury was so high in eels. And in the 80s, Europe banned the export of eels from the Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence River because there's such a high Myrex and PCB concentration in the eels. So contamination back in the 70s and 80s, it was really high in the environment in this area of concern and in Lake Ontario. And so this is a graph here with contaminants, different organic pollutants in eels. So the green is from the 80s, the orange is from the 90s, and the blue is from the 2000s. You could see back in the 80s, a lot of these organic pollutants was quite high in eels, and there has been a lot of research on it, and it did potentially impact their fitness and their ability to reproduce. But if you look at what those levels are today, so this is from 2008, and we would expect that a lot of these contaminants are even lower now, or at least not higher. That contamination has significantly reduced in eel. And this has been, it's been going down since the 80s, and we still don't see any recovery in the eel population. So it definitely, I think, is a contributing factor, but I don't think that it's the main reason why the eel have crashed in the river. And talking about the stocking program, so they knew, eel in 1986, they decreased very quickly in the river. And by the 2000s, that eel population was, as I mentioned, it was 1% of what it was in the 70s and the 80s, which is, it's a very, the biggest sort of reduction you could get. So the governments got together and they did this experimental conservation stocking program. So they grabbed little eels, so glass eels from the Maritimes, and this is a little complicated because it's not like stocking trout, where you can sort of artificially grow, baby trout and then put them in a lake. Eels cannot be bred in captivity. And they're all one population. So if you take from one place, you're still taking from the same population because, as I mentioned, it's just one whole American eel population in the world. So what they did, though, they took 6.8 million glass eels from the Maritimes, and they moved these glass eels to the Richelieu River and in the Upper St. Lawrence River and in the Bay of Quinte. So this program lasted for about 5 or 6 years. It stopped in 2010. And it was not entirely successful because they didn't consider that, yes, American eel is all one population, so their genetics are so similar that you cannot distinguish different populations, but there are certain types, and they call them ecotypes. So there's certain ecotypes within the eel population that look for that freshwater habitat. So they're, like I said, they're these females that like to grow extremely large, and they're looking to go into these tributaries of the Atlantic coast. So when they took these eels from the Maritimes and they moved them into the St. Lawrence River, the ecotype for those glass eels didn't match a lot of the time the ecotype of the eels that are found in the river. So eels from the Maritimes are they're not all, like I said, historically, it was 99% female eel in the St. Lawrence River. And in the Maritimes, that ratio is different. So there's more males that like to live along the coastal waters. So the sex ratio was different, and the maturation rate was also different. So eels that mature in the Maritimes don't have as long journey as eels that mature in Lake Ontario, for example. So they don't need to gather as much lipid reserves to make that trip to the Sargasso Sea because it is a lot shorter than eels coming from Lake Ontario. So that's why eels are so big in the river, because they need enough fat to be able to make that trip to the Sargasso Sea and to be able to make eggs and reproduce. So when they grabbed the eels from the Maritimes and they put them in the river, a lot of those eels had the same maturation rate as, maritime eels. So some of them lived in the river for 4 years, and they started migrating back to the sea. Whereas eels, as I mentioned, the average age for wild eels in the river is 22 years. So those eels that matured in 4 years, they didn't have enough fat on them to make it and to reproduce in the Sargasso Sea. So there was a large proportion of those eels that didn't have the right characteristics to successfully contribute to the reproductive output of the population. But there were still some eels that did have the right ecotype. So we still see eels today. We're in 2025, the stocking program ended in 2010, and there's still eels from the stocked program that are migrating back to the Sargasso Sea. 1/3 of the eels that they collected in the tailwaters were stocked in the right season and would likely make it to the Sargasso Sea to breed. So it wasn't entirely unsuccessful, but there was a lot of stuff that they didn't know at the time that they learned along the way. One of these things was that some of the eels from the Maritimes were infected with this nematode, this invasive swim bladder nematode. So they did do health screening for the stocking program, but it wasn't entirely successful, and they introduced from that stocking program this invasive species to the eels in the St. Lawrence River. So that was one of the impacts that came from the stocking program. This is a swim bladder nematode, so it's a little worm that infiltrates the swim bladder of eels. So the swim bladder is a part of the eel that controls its buoyancy, and eels have a really important vertical migration that they need to do. So when they're infected with this nematode, it impacts their ability to migrate. And you can see here, the first detected nematode was in 2010, and this is the prevalence of eels infected, and this is the year here. So that infection rate was, very low when it was first detected, and now there's a lot of the eels in the river that have this nematode. It used to be just the stocked eels that were infected with the nematode, but it has now transferred to the wild, naturally occurring eels as well. So this, because this happened far after the crash of the 80s, it's not the reason why the American eel population or the American eel abundance stock sort of crashed in the river, but it's something that we need to keep our eye on. So it's an emerging threat. And then the last threat is climate change, and this is all-encompassing. It impacts all of their life stages. There was a study on the Atlantic coast that looked at all the different sort of fish and shellfish populations, and I extracted some data from that study. And I found that they did the research, and they found that eels were highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And this was based on their climate exposure, which was very high. And when I say climate exposure, it's because eels live, in the sea, they live in coastal waters, they live in freshwater habitats. They have this huge range, and their exposure to the different impacts of climate change is very wide. So they get, the impacts of climate change in rivers, along the coast. So their exposure is very high, but they're not super sensitive to the impacts of climate change. They're not like a trout species that is a cool water species and is really sensitive to just slight changes of temperature. They're a little bit more robust, and they were evaluated as having a moderate biological sensitivity to the impacts of climate change. So it's definitely something that has impacted them, particularly at their spawning site. So we have had an increase in surface sea temperature that has impacted the plankton communities where in their spawning area. And the plankton communities contribute to what they call marine snow. And that's sort of like detritus that the larvae, the leptocephali, feed on. And basically, the increasing sea temperatures have impacted the production and sort of the composition of that food source for the larvae. So there has been changes, like impacts already seen from climate change on American eel.
And I quite love this body, or this beautiful piece of work by Emmanuel Gelber. just because it captures that journey, it captures that connection across such a big, wide habitat that they occupy from the marine, from the coastal marine into the riverine. And in particular, what I quite enjoy is how up here they have all of these different names, and as you get to spend more time with this like piece, you see this little nuance that comes through here. And I just absolutely love like all of these different, like there's even poetry in here, these thoughts and this beautiful journey back to the Sargasso Sea. And so I'm really grateful to be able to then have references like this to be able to show, and in particular through the language, the diversity of relationships that we have with the eel. And for us, like, you know, the only one that's missing up there is Kiwalongo. But you know what? It's all right, you know. Maybe they can write it in. But most importantly, what I think is within the work we do for the River Rapport is that we have this goal of mobilization or action. What is the consequence of what we find? Is it guiding us in a positive direction on how to address these issues? Do we need to come from a new direction? What does that new direction look like? And in this way, this work sort of touches on community, it touches on policy, it touches on research, it touches on culture and language. It has such a broad, sweeping relationship in those kinds of ways. And in particular, mobilization for us has kind of looked like this, through being a part of different kinds of workshops or being a part of different symposia, to be able to talk about the status of the eel. What's going on out there? What different research do people have? And being able to bring that all together and re-express it in this way, in this consistent narrative. We had this wonderful adventure up to Ottawa to advocate for the eel with a minister. Can't remember their name right now, but they weren't even there, so can't remember them if they weren't there. And we got to talk to their staff and deliver this sort of briefing note to the minister's staff. But even beyond that, like from just being a part of all these different landscapes and connections, I've been able to talk to so many different people within the eel realm. One of my really valuable friends, Leora, recently had this gathering in Kingston, New York, all the way down there, and we went to the Delaware River where I got to see and hold my first live eel. And it was really beautiful, and all I could think was like, how little are they here? Because the ones back home I'd have to have two good hands on it, and this one it's like slipping out all over the place. And it was also this really wonderful time. Like, it's the first time I was ever successful beading. You know, I mean, I'm quite known for the beadwork that I love, and I always get asked if I create anything, and I'm like, I don't get the same experience. It's not some relaxing medicine experience for me. I'm frustrated. I'm poking myself with stuff. But that day, for some reason, we just sat, you know, and we got to share about eel. We got to learn with each other. And, you know, it was kind of really beautiful the way that these young women from Akwesasne kind of helped guide me in this. You know, I helped them do the Ohandagali Wadakwa before we ate, and then they helped me learn a skill and create something that I feel like really connects for me with the eel. And even beyond that kind of work too, we've been able to gather in different kinds of ways. You know, through this work, I got the support to be able to pursue gathering in Akwesasne. And, you know, it wasn't as successful as like I hoped it was, but, you know, we learned some language. We got to sit with a clan mother. She got to do her version of the Ohandagali Wadakwa, which had like a really interesting relationship with the eel. I got to go ask her more questions about it. And I was like, I never heard that word, or I never heard that expression about what the eel does in relationship to the bottom of the river. And this is sort of this like really interesting way that like the Ohandagali Wadakwa can reflect so many different relationships from the language we use. And that was her personal way of talking about it. And then we had been learning our own versions of it. And to be able to catch that nuance and to be able to share that briefing note with her, to be able to connect what we're doing and trying to affect back to the traditional governance system, the Confederacy. And then the eel artwork that has been so beautifully woven throughout this presentation, and being able to present about this at the symposium. And even as we continue to keep moving forward and pushing through partnership and through community building to call for action, you know, what I really kind of think about in these times, and in particular, one of my most treasured teachers about grief, about responsibility, about caring for each other was Carol Warrior, who passed in the summer of 2018, and I can still continue to feel what she taught me and shared me and gifted me during that time through so much of my work. And you know, I think about the cycles she always talked about, the relationships, looking to the land for teacher. What does the eel teach us, right? And in particular, form is a temporary expression of energy or vibration. These pulsing oscillations cycle through birth, life, death, renewal, and again, life. And isn't that just like the journey of the eel? Isn't that the journey of us? Isn't that the journey of the knowledge we generate, of the action that we generate, this iteration over time of innovation, of new opportunities? Because what we now have is some hope, I think. I believe in this. I believe in the hope that we're moving in ways that are calling for transparency, are calling for accountability, are calling for a community of building to address this issue together, instead of trying to be contentious with each other, to show up and ask, why hasn't anything been done? Like, because these conversations are not new. What we are doing here happened 20 years ago, and there was no action around it. And so now I think it's important to remind ourselves of that, to remind, hey, we don't have as much time as we did before, and now we have to really push and advocate. And as a part of these different working groups, like, you know, we're sharing through our eel sessions, through the practice of art, so people can experience and relate to the eel. There is this beautiful feasibility study being done by Natel Energy with fish-friendly turbines that have a survival, I think it was like 99%. And this change, you know, costs about a 1% change in energy. And I'm not even sure about that. Like, I really am just not sure, like, whether it's as major as they think, or if it's as small as we've said it is, or, you know, like, I want to know, and I want to be able to challenge these feasibility ideas, because too long we've been told that things aren't possible. And if anybody has been living in this world for the past 5 years, I think we are fully well aware that we've been told so much throughout our lives that is impossible, that is going to require some incremental change, is actually possible. We've seen it through COVID. We've seen it through government shifts. We've seen it through the way that our relationships have changed. And, like, you know, this big effort to bring people together in community and push forward. And this is always, like, my love in thinking about how are we going to address complex issues. The eel is a subject of a complex issue, a complex jurisdiction, a complex life and relationship, and it requires complex solutions. And so we're all a part of this with our voices, with our science, with all the different pieces that we are a part in that relationship with the eel. And so, you know, this to me, and part of this relationship with Talking Rivers was the creation of the Giwalungo American eel rights, to propose that shouldn't the eel have rights too? And what would that mean if the eel had rights? You know, and part of the central pieces of their work is that, you know, the river has rights, but doesn't the eel have a responsibility to the river and a presence? And doesn't the river have a responsibility to the eel and this interconnectivity? And don't we have a responsibility to the eel to advocate, to speak up, to write those letters that we are annoyed by, to show up to meetings, to break down silos, to bring transparency in whatever way that looks like, and demand some change? And we'll do that through the work that we contribute to the world, where our science is directly connected to the policy work, is directly connected to conversations in the world. And, you know, I'm going to talk about the eel everywhere I go. You know, it will be an indicator in the evaluation of the health of the Great Lakes if it's the last thing I do, you know, to ask why you should be here. And that's something that, I'm really grateful of the opportunity to be a part of this community, because then I'm able to sort of traverse those different spaces, whether it be international, whether it be national or provincial, or even states within those governments, and even on the community level, where my community is still trying to figure out how to relate with the eel again and reclaim that, and oftentimes maybe rejecting that. And so there's just a lot of hope and energy that we can change this story, that we don't have to know a future without the eel in our territory anymore, that we can fulfill our responsibility to ensure that they continue to be here. And so that is us for today. Now, Tuknigo. Not even sure how long that was. I was like, is there a clock in here somewhere? Because one thing I can do is talk. Perfect.
Question, Q&A. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, perfect. And I'll just grab your mic pieces, and then
We will share this one.
yeah, perfect. Okay, great.
Elaine Kennedy. I'd like to thank both of you. My right brain and my left brain have both been worked tonight and learned things, and it was tremendous. I really enjoyed it. My main question is, when you talked about how in 1986 on that graph there was that terrible decline, maybe I missed something along the way, but I didn't quite understand in all the information that you gave us, which was great. What do the scientists think, and what do Abe, on the other hand, what do the knowledge holders think happened at that particular time? Because when I looked at the maturity of the eels coming up after the dams were built, I didn't quite compute.
Yeah, want me to say? Yeah, so there is no definite answer to this. But if you think of the eel life cycle, so we'll go back to this graph here. If you think of the eel life cycle, especially in the river, as being, around 25-ish years, and all of those dams went in the 50s and 60s across their whole range, there's going to be a leg of this impact, and it might be a life cycle. So if you look at, let's say, lots of the dams went in the 50s and the 60s, and by the 60s, a majority of their range has been fragmented. If you look at that and leg a life cycle onto that, that would explain the decline in the 80s. And this is habitat loss, so fragmentation, so dams that don't have any upstream passage, and turbine mortality for the ones that do have upstream passage. But back in that time, I don't think a lot of dams did have, 1974 for the Moses Sounders, that's when upstream passage was facilitated. So there is no definite answer, but based on the numbers, habitat loss and barriers to migration, definitely for the St. Lawrence River seems to be the one that might impact eel the most. But it's definitely cumulative impacts of climate change, of habitat fragmentation, of fisheries, of all of these things I talked about today. But just based on the numbers, a hypothesis would be that it would be that habitat loss and barriers to migration. Yeah, because their life cycle is so long in the river. So those numbers do add up, and I guess that's my educated opinion on what it would be, and I'll pass it to Abe.
Yeah, and I'm not totally certain, it doesn't seem to be this overt conversation in Akwesasne about the eel, and I sort of am intrigued by that history, particularly the way that Catholicism influenced us. And I think, because we were known as the praying Indians, and I think there's this, me and some colleagues have had really beautiful conversations about this history, because originally we practiced Catholicism by our own choice. And it would become this sort of imposed thing in the late 1800s. That was part of why we became the Seven Nations fire, our council, Akwesasne was a part of that. We didn't rejoin the Haudenosaunee Confederacy until about 1890. And we had originally left for quite a while because we didn't want to be a part of, I believe it was the Beaver Wars. Not a professional historian, not like, there's so many wonderful historians from Akwesasne that can document this. But from my own experience, and the way that Catholicism sort of created this really deep distance between people in our community and their connection to the culture, to the language, and the inheritance of different ideas, like the snake being this thing that we don't want in our relationship. And they sort of, as I've kind of like, a fisherman I interviewed was like, well, I think it's because they kind of look like snakes. And I was like, what an obvious thing to say. What an obvious thing to say, but ultimately really opened my mind in those kinds of way to start questioning, like, why. And I think it does come down to like this way that certain values and ideas perforate across our lives, and we get to ask we have the opportunity to question those things and reimagine what those relationships can look like, of like why we do things in the certain ways. And this is where I'm sort of, I can't say with like exact perfect certainty that was why the eel sort of went out of our relationship in sort of that kind of way, but that's sort of the theory I'm kind of working with, because I know what Catholicism did to me and my family, and the way that it distanced us as at least my grandmother as a medicine woman. And I called her an underground medicine woman because it was that we would always get comments, well, we don't talk about that. And as I kind of grew in that understanding, she didn't want us to know certain things, or we were told we had to act in a certain way because it was their attempt at protecting us against the implications of the system. Historically, being Indigenous was not the thing. We weren't allowed to be proud of that. We were targeted, we were excluded, and we still deal with that to a certain extent. The dispossession, the erasure, and I think the eel got caught up in that story too. And the reason I relate to things so much in this kind of way is because of like my as a two-spirit person, I had to ask myself, where did we go? When did we get removed from our communities in this way? And because you know what, the Jesuits wrote about us, and I always feel like the interaction they had they were like, why do people express their gender in this way? When the Jesuits asked that, it was sort of like, I just imagine this person being annoyed, and it's just like, because it's always been like that. They were in the creation story, and it was just kind of like, but where in the creation story? What happened? When did we get when did we get lost in there? And so, as a part of this decolonization journey in my brain and in my heart and my body and my spirit, I'm also reflecting on how did it implicate other things around us, whether it be the eel, whether it be even the eagle, and what does that mean to our practice of science and the questions that we're asking. I mean, it's a lot of thoughts to try to like think about, and sometimes, I always kind of like joke about like I need my dissociation and TikTok time to just like not think about anything for a little while. But yeah, that's where I'm relating to them, and because I know people ate them. I've heard of them as medicines. I've heard of them in these so many different ways, but I've never seen it in application. I never, skinned an eel by putting them in the crux of a tree and using socks to pull the skin off because they're so slimy. But, and that was so cool to me that that was a part of somebody's story. But I hope that it does become a part of my story, and that it's something I can relate with. And that's why I kind of mentioned the piece of I'm not a huge fan of fish, but I'm trying to change that because, you know what, I hope my kids are able to enjoy fish, and, that my awareness of what's happening here. And, there was one thought that kind of resonated with me as we were going through this. I just kind of want to share it. Is just the contamination piece of it, and the need for peace of mind. This idea that's more recent to me that kind of reminds me of the precautionary principle. Kind of reminds me of the Ohandagaluidakwa and keeping other things in consideration. And that's what I hope to do. I hope to be able to share that, to connect with those relatives and integrate that into my life so my kids can really understand that and actually practice it. Without sort of where I feel like in my life, I'm competing with so many different ideas of where I need to put my focus and attention, and hope for a future where that's softer and kinder to me that I can be a part of those things. So, that's kind of this long way of like, hey, the elders aren't saying a whole lot, but I think it's because of this deeper history. And it's my responsibility as somebody that's aware of that tension to then sort of move in a way that can address that. So, yeah, sorry. I went way in a whole journey on that one.
We'll take more questions. Does anybody else have something?
Thank you so much. I could listen to both of you all evening. Excuse me. Mine's a more down-to-earth question. Does every dam have a ladder? Do they all have ladders for the?
Yeah, no, we are actually very lucky in the St. Lawrence River that both of the major dams now each have 2 ladders. But if you look at the Ottawa River, for example, as Abe said, the American eel is virtually extirpated from the Ottawa River because they have no access. Because that first dam, Carillon Dam, the first dam entering the Ottawa River at the outlet of the Ottawa River doesn't have an eel ladder. So no eels are able to get upstream. So that's Ottawa River used to be an extremely productive habitat as well, and we're lucky at least to have these upstream these eel ladders here, but not. There's a lot of dams that don't have these ladders at all. And yeah, it's I live actually at the top of the Ottawa River, and my partner is Algonquin, and we live in his community, and my son is Algonquin, and it's sad because I work with Abe, and he has this, he's seeing this relative, disappear from his territory, and if I look at Logan and my son Harrison, they don't even have that relationship to the eel because it's disappeared from the Ottawa River. And there used to be actually a commercial fishery in Ville Marie, which is close to where I live, for eel. That's what Logan told me. And it's very, very extremely rare to see an eel in the Ottawa River because they don't have that connectivity. So we're actually fortunate to have that upstream passage. We just have to find a way to get safer downstream passage here in the river now.
Wouldn't it not be a responsibility of like Hydro-Quebec and OPG, and if everybody knew that, wouldn't they be doing the right thing?
Yes. I mean, we could definitely go in a bunch of different directions on that one, but I just think that this is that piece that I think I continue to reinforce, as we all need to be a part of this conversation. And it can't be a pushing of accountability and responsibility on everybody else. You do see narratives where like the Mi'kmaq communities in Mi'kma'ki and New Brunswick are struggling. There are communities that are struggling, and the glass eel fishery is something that is helping them, stay alive in some respects. And they're being blamed in some ways in regards to the decline, right? But also within this whole thing, like I think about Marshall, and the Marshall case, which affirmed our fishing rights. It was something that happened in the 90s, and these battles that we've had to affirm these rights. And even for ourselves, we had our Adams case here, which affirmed our rights to fish, because historically our stuff would get taken from us. And so, yes, I hope they show up. I will say it must be so much cheaper to at least talk to somebody than to have to hide and then, have to deal with the outflow of that accountability. I feel like, the legal system is not where we're going to find our justice. I don't want a payment for the absence of the eel. I want the eel. I think this ultimately, when I was in Geneva this summer, this lady, Auntie Vi, just said something that really hit me, and in particular, she was like, we have a right to ice, and she's from an Inuit community in way far north, Alaska, and I just kind of I was like, well, we have a right to eel here. We have a right to this land. We have a right to these ecosystems and to enjoy them, to engage them, to feel safe in engaging them. And so that's like my hope. That's my hope in the long run, that they can show up and be a part of the solution instead of, curtailing. And it's not just OPG. It's like, there's accountabilities within the governments and how species at risk are determined. What do the species at risk issues mean now, considering Bill 5 and Bill C5 and, my goodness, whatever omnibus bill that's been passed in the past couple of days? And this is where I think scientists have this new responsibility to be, advocating for our science to reach the policy and political platforms. And that way, bad science doesn't end up in there, or, because I see the implications of what that looks like. Right? And that's just because I like to read a lot of random things. But it's that way of, yes, please show up. Please try. I think OPG is doing some stuff, is part of the solution. But I think the bigger resistance is ultimately grounded in, I don't know what. I really don't know. I want to find out. I would just like to talk to somebody, I don't want it to I don't imagine all these people in this big room overseeing the waters being like, you know what, we need to put another dam there. We see moving water, another dam, and that's the big dam, little dam industrial complex. Me and Stephanie are working on that, but I really think that I hope that they'll be a part of the solution, and not in this way that fossil fuel industry is a part of attempting to be a part of the solution in climate change.
I think I'm just going to follow up with that. I think we all have a role to play in this, and government has a role to play, industry has a role to play. We all have a role to play, and you guys are fulfilling your responsibility for being here and learning about the eel. And I hope you go and talk to your friends about the eel, and we could get everybody to love the eel and care about the eel. And I think that's ultimately where we're going to get the power to make change, for the eel. This has been going on since 1958 for almost 70 years in our river, and it's time for change now.
I think we'll take one more question. Yeah.
I think it's pretty quick. Thanks. I loved your presentation. Thanks very much. I guess I see there's fishing of eels, but where does eel live in the balance of the ecological balance here? Do they feed eagles? Where are they? Where is there? I don't want to use the word need, but what are they used for?
Yeah, so ecologically, they're top predators in the river. So they're feeding, they're balancing that food web. They're feeding on a variety of different prey items. They're also, especially when they're baby eels, they're also important prey in the Maritimes for different wildlife as well. So here in the river where we are, because they're so large, they are the top predators of the river in the aquatic system anyway. But Matt probably knows if are there any predators for the eel in our parts of the river?
Very few things can eat a large adult eel. They're just the way they live and their size, and they have these really amazing features too that make them hard to capture. And but there's a really interesting concept you can think about too, where because they come from the ocean, they're bringing all of this biomass from the ocean into freshwater systems and making all of that available. So it's this conduit of energy, if you want to think about it, into inland and then back out again into the ocean. But it's this migration that happens every fall. Is this opportunity where you see it with salmon as well. Lots of predators show up, and I know humans took advantage of this too during the out-migration as well. But yeah, I think you touched on this. There used to be estimates, maybe 50% of the biomass of the St. Lawrence River near shore was eels, one species. So yeah, while I have this, I just want to thank both of you. That was amazing. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. You brought to life, what the eel is, and I think that's exactly what you're touching on. We need to all have that responsibility to get people to care, right? So, I guess I had a fun question for you, but people love telling me, and I know there's too, I'm sure, this story they had about eels when they were a kid, or this interaction, and I don't know, just wondering if you had like a favorite story you've heard about eels.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think like my favorite experience with the eel, not actually living one, was actually with Stephanie. We got to see how you skin an eel with like the cool way, by like the way these teachers, these Mi'kmaq teachers were like, well, if you want to show off, this is how you do it. And so what they did was when they were cleaning the eel, you can like sever here, and then you can bite the spine, and then you just pull the skin right off, and it comes off in just like one like it was crazy. And so that's one of my favorite memories from Steph, is just being able to see that, because I was just struggling to hold the eel at first. And then I guess like my second favorite one was like, we had a baby eel, or like a little eel, that we were taking, like was a part of our pictures, and it kept doing this thing where it would just kind of like jump out of the bowl, that we were trying to like share space with it, and it was like trying to get into the river next to us, and I was like, oh my god, I'm like trying to fight with this eel to just stay in the picture. But yeah, so that's my favorite stories about the eel, other than being little and like our dogs always getting into them and rolling in them, and my gosh, do they stink.
I don't really have any happy stories about eel. I only ever seen live eels once, and it was at the OPG tour of the dam, and I was so excited, like for 2 weeks before. I'm like, oh, I can't wait to see it. I'm so excited. And then I got there and I saw the ladder, and I wish I could show you a picture. It's like, you gotta look up. Like, these eels have to travel. I couldn't do it. So like, it's just incredible that, this fish could do it. And I went home and I cried. I was so excited. It was just so sad to see, like, what they have to do to get upstream. And I've been working on this eel research for the past year and a half, and it's been the hardest thing I've ever had to work on. Like, it's really, like, yeah, so I don't have any happy stories. Yeah, I hope I do one day, though. Yeah, I hope I do one day, and yeah, I think about them every day, so.
Well, I think, yeah.
Yeah, just trying to be mindful of time a bit. I think we'll bring it to a close now. Thank you again both so much, and thanks everybody for coming.